Okay, so ethmoid bone. This is what this diagram is. This is in our diagram packet that is separate from our notes. So let's go ahead and label this as the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone plugs into the skull from the cranial vault. It's got like a pronged plug process where it plugs in. In the midline, it's got this structure called the perpendicular plate. When it plugs in the middle of the frontal bone from the brain cavity then this perpendicular plate creates this bony nasal septum, the upper portion of the bony nasal septum. And then the lateral two prongs are called the bodies of the ethmoid. And there's a lot of anatomy and structure in this small little bone where it sits plugged in from the cranial cavity, or where the brain's at, into the nasal cavity. So, bodies of the ethmoid can make the medial borders of the orbital. They also create part of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, along with the maxillary bone. Okay, so let's talk about this ethmoid bone. You can see it from all different directions. You can take the skull cap off and see the ethmoid bone between the frontal bone. We'll look at that in just a second. You can also see the ethmoid bone from looking through the nasal cavity on the skull. On a human who's alive, or just a cadaver that hasn't been dissected, you cannot see the ethmoid bone just looking at the skull. All right, so we're going to draw the ethmoid bone a little bit. The first thing we'll look at is there are two plates that are on the ethmoid bone. This horizontal plate that basically separates the nasal cavity here from the cranial or neurocavity where the brain sets is this horizontal plate called the cribriform plate. Now, when we look at the top side of the cribriform plate, if we go back into our notes, let me see real quick. We want to look at, let me scroll up real quick to the top of this diagram. This is the first page of this diagram packet. And you can see this purple bone right here in the middle of this frontal bone in blue. This is the ethmoid bone right here. This plate is the cribriform plate. Within this plate, there are many different little holes that are tiny. We call a hole in a bone a foramen. These are tiny little holes, and we're going to call these cribriform foramina. So these are tiny little holes. These little foramina of the cribriform plate are for a nerve called the olfactory nerve, which is cranial nerve number 1. Has these little nerve endings where these nerve endings pass through these cribriform foramina and go down into our nasal cavity, and that's how we smell. Because olfactory means smell. Okay? Now, it's hard to see on this diagram, but we'll see it on other ones. Right here in the middle of the cribriform plate, there is a vertical process that sticks up right here in the center. If we scroll back down, here where we can see the nasal cavity, here is the cribriform plate right in through here, and then this vertical structure is the one we're talking about. We're going to draw that in right here that comes up and creates this little knob. This vertical structure is called the cristigale. This is all on the brain or neuro side of the ethmoid bone. Okay? Then when we look at the inferior or underside to the cribriform plate, then we get into the nasal cavity portion. So, under the cristigale, there is a structure that comes down like this. This right here is called the perpendicular plate. The perpendicular plate is the upper 2/3 of the bony nasal septum. upper 2/3 of the bony nasal septum. It doesn't create the whole septum, but it creates the majority of it, and it comes from the upper because the ethmoid is plugged in from the frontal bone down. Okay? So then we have these lateral mass structures on the side that come off of the cribriform plate and are lateral on both sides. So they're bilateral to the perpendicular plate. These structures come down and they form these big bony structures with these knobs that hang down like this. This is the body, so I'll call this the left body, left ethmoid body, and this one is the right ethmoid body. Okay? Now, within the body, on the medial side, so this is like looking down the nasal cavity, here's the septum, your nasal septum. So here's the left nasal cavity between the left body and the perpendicular plate, that's the left nasal cavity. And then between the right body and the perpendicular plate is the right nasal cavity. Okay? These large bony projections that we've drawn here, these are called concha. So these right here, these upper ones, are called superior nasal concha. Now, it's spelled like you might want to call it concha, but they're concha. Those are superior nasal concha. Are you able to read that over the perpendicular plate? Okay. Now, as the body comes down, it gives off these two large projections of bone on the underside. These are called the middle nasal concha. So ethmoid bone has the superior and middle nasal concha. These actually create a physical barrier for when you breathe in through your nose. Dust, pollens, different pollutants can't just go straight into your respiratory system. One of the main reasons we say it's always better to breathe in through your nose and not your mouth. It's healthier to be a nose breather, not a mouth breather. Okay? All right, now, we'll come back to this nasal concha in a little bit because they're separate bones that create the inferior nasal concha, but they're their own two separate bones that plug into the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. But the superior and middle is part of the ethmoid. Now, the last thing on the bodies here is on the left and right bodies, we're going to have these cavities called sinuses. We're going to come back and talk about sinuses some more, but with this ethmoid bone, I want to go ahead and talk about these sinuses now. You can have, usually we'll find, you should find, that's a better way to say it, a superior, a middle, and an inferior ethmoid sinus. In this diagram, there are two superiors that are side by side, there are two middles, and then we have two inferior ethmoid sinuses. So, on here, I'm going to shade these in color. So in the green, I'm going to put a marking right here, and I'm going to call this the superior ethmoid sinus. Okay? And then the middle ones, we'll go ahead and shade in red. And this is the middle ethmoid sinus. And then we'll go ahead and use black for the inferior ones. It's the inferior ethmoid sinus. Okay. And so that's our ethmoid bone. Always reminds me of kind of a three-pronged plug that plugs in from the neurocavity down into the nasal cavity. It helps separate that neurospace where the brain's at from the nasal cavity. Now, one other thing on our diagrams with the ethmoid bone before we take a break. We can see we have the ethmoid bone here. We can see the yellow is the maxillary bone. Here's our orbital socket. The blue is the frontal bone where the brain would sit up here. Here's our crista galli. If you want to flip to this diagram real quick, you can either use it for practice or you can label it now. This is the crista galli. Just below that, there's a tag going in here. This is going to the perpendicular plate. We always call it the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. Okay. Right in through here, we have two lines. It looks like both of these, this one's kind of going into this upper recessor cavity. We don't have to worry about that. But this one right here, so this one I'd say don't try to name that area. This right here is the superior nasal concha. Then again, it's talking about that. So we got a superior nasal cavity space. Then here we've got the middle nasal cavity space. Again, I wouldn't worry about naming that. This is the middle nasal concha. Okay. Now we haven't gotten to the inferior nasal concha yet. That's the next bone we need to talk about. We're going to talk about the inferior nasal concha. There's two of them, so they're bilateral. And then we're going to talk about this bone that makes up the lower 1/3 of the bony nasal septum, and that's called the vomer. So let's go ahead and name these two now since we're here. So this bone right here is going to be the inferior nasal concha. We don't need to worry about the inferior nasal cavity. We'll come over here. We'll name this bone right in through here. This is the vomer. We'll talk about that here in a second. We'll go ahead and name the rest of these. This is the maxillary sinus. This is in the orbital cavity, but this green bone we haven't talked about yet. This is the sphenoid bone. This line pointing up here to the blue, this is the frontal bone, but this cavity right here is the frontal sinus. And then the last thing I want to talk about in this lecture, we'll come down with this diagram. And this bone that's tagged right here, do you know what that yellow bone is? Maxillary. Now, the underside underneath our nasal cavity, that part of the maxillary is going to be what structure of the maxillary bone? Do you remember? Maxillary. The palatine process. So this is our maxillary bone. I'm going to put that, and so I'm going to put in here palatine process. Okay. So we've done the ethmoid bone. Next lecture, we'll talk about the inferior nasal concha and the vomer.